So very easy topic for the evening session. It's just economy, energy, and climate change, nothing less. So welcome to the, I won't quote my dear friend Srećko Horvat about the apocalypse, but as we heard previous speakers on the state of our democracy, challenges from the digital, from the foreign, or which some who are writing democracy defense package for the European Commission are saying this malign influences that we are open to showed its full force after Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. So we are now witnessing a huge challenge for our resilience in terms of what will be the economy model that we put on paper, and that is for Europe to be climate neutral upon 2050. With this energy crisis, soaring inflation that we witnessed, maybe people on this panel have answers, because energy and climate change play both into geopolitics and also to the issue of our democracy, which we saw, for example, in the debate with climate change prior to the war in Ukraine. So as this panel is the shortest, it will last until 7:15, I'm very happy to introduce our first keynote speaker, and that is Guntram Wolf. You will start, as I understood, come join me. You will talk about the energy shock that we experienced in last year, and we'll see if we learned something from it and where can we go from now. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's 6 p.m. in the evening, and we are talking about economics. Okay, so this is going to be difficult, but thanks for bearing with me. So I want to first talk about the energy shock and the lessons we can learn from the 2022 experience. After that, I want to talk about climate and the systemic rivalry with China. And of course, also give you a bit of a sense of what's going to be next. So let me be very quick on the 22 energy shock. I think the first big lesson is that strategic complacency is very costly, right? I mean, we could have done better if we had listened to the many, many warnings that were out there. And I think it's important to recognize this. It costs us several percentage of GDP in terms of buying more expensive alternatives. But, and that's an important second lesson, is we managed to actually get through this massive energy shock without an economic Armageddon. You might remember at the beginning of 22, there were statements out there that the German economy could decline by up to 10%, that all of Central and Eastern Europe, which also were very dependent on Russian gas, would suffer massively. That fate was avoided. And that fate was avoided because of, I would say, really two important factors. I mean, the first is we let markets actually operate largely on, let markets operate and do much of the adjustment. This was really important. The price signal was there. We didn't cut the price signal. We ensured that the price signal was there and was felt, and therefore people and firms adjusted. And this adjustment was adjustment in terms of energy savings. We saved, in some weeks, temperature adjusted 20 to 30% of gas. It was efficiency investments. It was investments in insulation. And it was also a very important political response on the supply side, building supply infrastructure, LNG terminals and others in rapid time. The second, third point from the 22 crisis was that European integration actually helped. I mean, it really helped to keep the European energy market open, let energy flow, and ensure that gas that used to flow from the east to the west, from Russia to the west, actually all of a sudden was flowing from the northwest, the north, so Norway, LNG terminals, to Germany and to Central and Eastern Europe. Germany became an energy hub, supplying energy to the east, quite a different role. And this was absolutely crucial that this gas continued to flow, because otherwise, not only would there have been major economic disruptions, but also all the supply chains, the economic integration would really have suffered. And that was prevented. And I think it's really important that we let the markets do the adjustment. There was social, fiscal benefits to ensure that social hardship was dampened, but the price adjustment and the supply roads remained open throughout. Now, we also learned that the price signal works in terms of energy savings, and therefore it's a good climate policy. And that brings me to my next point, in which I want to talk about where I see the main issue in climate policy and climate action, and that is actually China by now. And let me start by saying that when we talk about China, we often have this trio. It's a systemic rival, it's a competitor, and it's a cooperation partner, right? And the cooperation partner, many politicians, Yellen, Ursula von der Leyen, Annalena Baerbock, many others say, well, that's the area where we want to work together with China. It's cooperation, right? China is cooperation on climate. Well, the truth is that we've long entered a phase of systemic rivalry on climate policies with China. And let me give you quickly the main reasons. China is pursuing a totally different emission path to that of Europe and the US. Chinese emissions are growing rapidly, massively. China has added almost the entirety of the European Union's emission in the last 10 years in its annual emissions. China is now emitting 4 times the emissions of the entire European Union, and its per capita emissions have reached the emissions levels of the European Union. So massive acceleration of climate change, where Chinese emissions by now continue to drive global emission increases. China is not doing this at home. It is also exporting that model, a model driven by coal-fired power plants, delivering cheap energy in the context of its Belt and Road Initiative, where subsidies were given to actually support that model. That is clearly also a big step towards accelerating climate change, but also a step towards a systemic rivalry where a very different system is being advanced. And lastly, of course, we are in big competition with China and rivalry with China on the technology, the green technology. Now, what to do? It's called a summit, time to decide. And I want to argue that there's real trade-offs that we have to face and that we have to think about as Europeans and as national decision makers here in Europe. The first question regards and concerns the speed of decarbonization. We are being told sometimes that faster decarbonization might be even a good thing for growth. Our Commission President likes to call the Green Deal our growth strategy. The reality is that as you accelerate decarbonization, it does have effects on, at least in the short term, on economic growth, on welfare. And that's why when you follow the news, there's a lot of resistance, social resistance to some of the issues that are being proposed by some governments at the moment that accelerate our decarbonization efforts. So one big question is the speed of decarbonization. How do we get that right? The second is, how much of decarbonization do we do at home and how much do we invest in decarbonization elsewhere? I think this is really important in the context of the systemic rivalry with China. We are underinvesting, if you ask me, we are underinvesting in decarbonization in third countries. We need to find energy partnerships, energy transition partnerships, and support them financially, back them up with real money, because only then a decarbonization model will become attractive in these third countries and third economies, and only then will we be able to compete with China on the systemic rivalry. And last, and I'll end with that, my time is also up, is we of course have to invest in technologies. Decarbonization is costly. In some areas we don't even yet have the technological solutions. And we have to invest in these technologies to actually make it a reality, this decarbonization, and make it affordable to not just rich Western economies, but really also to poor countries around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Guntram, for this fantastic pinpointing the situation. And I have to say also that you are writing with some other people, it's in the making, a book on macroeconomics on decarbonization, which will be out and published by Cambridge University Press. So we're looking forward to your inputs at the end of discussion. We've heard also Kirsten pinpointing very important things during the previous two sessions. So I want to invite you here for our second keynote with basically map us finally what we're discussing here all day and relationship with climate change.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I am noting the title of this session, Fueling the Future, Economy, Energy and the Environment. My challenge is that from the perspective that I'm working from as an implementer of climate action, we probably want to reframe that as securing the future, or perhaps better, making the future for humans livable and possible. So let me start by making a connection back to one of the comments that I made earlier at the beginning of this session on the fact that we are on trajectory for a 4-degree future. Actually, we are on track for 2 degrees before 2050, 3 degrees by 2070, and 5 degrees by the end of the century. Unless we do decarbonize at a scale and at a pace that is dramatically disruptive. So the question is, what does that mean? Why does that happen? Because we have underestimated planetary tipping points, the feedback loops that we only really begin now to fully understand. But I think one of the most important things that we need to bring into this conversation, and particularly the trigger for this conversation, is polycrisis, the effects of physical risk, the effects of transition risk, and what ultimately are the nexus of adaptation and mitigation that we've barely begun to understand. Most infrastructure in climate action is not designed for 50 to 55 degrees. Most infrastructure is not designed for 3 or 4 1-in-100-year storms happening every single year. And the social and political tipping points are, in fact, the ones that come first. So one of the things we are really deeply unprepared for, and the Ukraine crisis is beginning to help us understand, is that is really what we need to begin to understand. We will lose our grip on the conditions in which to effect stable, managed transitions, affordable, accessible prosperity shifts, if we lose our grip on social and political stability. So, in other words, we are dealing with a situation where we need to train ourselves to transform in crisis. In, with, and through crisis. And perhaps we in Europe are now facing a situation where this is one of the best training grounds we can possibly find. We need a new design for human life, a design that will enable 10 billion people to live successfully, prosperously, and in balance on this planet. And at the moment, Europe is a place in the world where structural momentum, a combination of multi-level regulation, policy, action, even aspirational pictures of possibility are extremely well constructed. And they open up a space of possibility for transformation. The precedent of catalyzing unprecedented change using emergency measures, of beginning to act together, does open up a very interesting space for action. And I want to focus on how can Europe offer something in that context. What is it that Europe offers? What do I mean by that? But I want to just very quickly bring in one way of making sense of what's happening in Ukraine. ETH Zurich has come up with a map of what the geopolitics of the world look like in a future where the future is entirely renewable. It's a completely different map. of who holds power and who holds the trading rights and who has power over whom. And I think that's one of the things to bear in mind if we look at what is playing out between Russia and Ukraine. Most of the Russian campaign is paid for by oil and gas revenues. There is a really interesting tectonic plate shift here, really coming around in terms of how the world moves. And that does go back to some of our root cause issues on how we think about the underlying structures and assumptions. So how can Europe offer, and what can Europe offer to secure a green and prosperous future, which is one of the core questions for this last session, and in the context of war on the threshold? The first element is place-based demonstrations. The Horizon Europe missions, the European mission on climate smart and neutral cities, 112 cities committing to decarbonize by 2030. Amsterdam, Madrid, Rome, Paris, small cities and big cities. Grounded in multiple identities, beginning to pull in the element of thinking systemically and acting systemically on the ground, in places, connecting to different cultural identities, helping people intuitively get a sense that this is about shifting all levers and intervention points. It is about coming up with new physical, social, cultural and economic designs. The way in which, and the adaptation mission, the soil mission, the ocean mission, these are constructs and frameworks that open up a space for demonstrating possibility and for capturing the imagination on the ground. The way in which those initiatives train a generation or multiple generations of people to learn to work and lead in uncertainty, but deliberate, strategically designed uncertainty, using emergency measures, using portfolio approaches, using multiple different interventions simultaneously, starting to build deliberately towards composite, structurally different business models, ecosystem services, thinking in complexity in ways that we have actually educated ourselves not to do for decades. That's immensely important, in part also because what it opens up a frame for and a practical demonstration ground for is plural, polycentric, networked action. Acting in interdependence across multiple cohorts of actors, but acting with the diversities and with the difference embedded and encoded inside them. And for me, this is one of the elements that Europe really offers. The idea of Europe, and we were referring to that before, and I really want to bring back Kim's reference to this, shifting our notion of the imaginative a frame of what Europe represents as a space for negotiating plural, polycentric, network, distributed, decentralized action that is nonetheless linked and brought under a framework of common intent and shared values and shared purpose. There is something immensely powerful about that. Think of Europe as one of the few places in the world where you could experiment at scale with managed commodity trading on scarce resources. That's worth trying. It's worth demonstrating. Then there's the question of risk. At the moment, our greatest risk as a species, as economies, as political units, as businesses and as citizens is the status quo. Once we start to feed that into our economic thinking and to our financial management, the relative investment of investing into managed transitions through large-scale, place-based innovation implementations starts to look like a very, very tiny investment to manage a very, very big cost. And it comes back then to the particular European nature of security responses and the rise in security investments. 90% of the solar panels coming into Europe come from China, but 70% of the chips in them come from one company in the Netherlands. There are complexities in the global system that start to open up opportunities in the way in which we think about security. How do we start to think about an investment in securitizing and creating security for the whole population with an emphasis on polyuse, on multifunction, on the way in which any technology that we use and we develop needs to have an application to civil and peace-building, peacemaking environments. And then the last reflection I wanted to make is on the possibility of Europe as a project going forward for its multiple generations and working towards intergenerational relationships, not as a negative peace project, but as a positive peace project. I believe that it is the challenge that Europe needs to make up its mind about is, on the one hand, creating space for a paradigm shift in economics and politics towards something that is intensely human-centric, regenerative, based on sufficiency and balance and resiliency, and the opportunity to lead and demonstrate that that is possible at scale, really bringing people, planet, and prosperity together. And on the other hand, the opportunity to address the critical problem of scale. The scale, the systemic scale of climate and climate change concerns, biodiversity collapse, pollution, and the degradation of human circumstances demands policy mechanisms that bridge borders, that engage the problem at its own scale. And if not individual institutional actors, then coalitions of actors who are willing to solidify around the intent to transform. That, I think, is Europe's remarkable distinctive possibility, to create and hold space for that, so that the time to decide becomes the time to decide whether we want a future and what that future will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for very insightful keynotes. I would like to bring in, I forgot you at the beginning, but I didn't forget you at the end, Mary Warlick, Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. I want to ask you to pick on what we heard from the perspective of basically World's Energy Authority, because what was happening with the war in Ukraine made you also rethink some things. So basically your comment, because you were writing very thoroughly what everyone was saying. And the second point, which I think is of crucial importance of what both and Guntram and Kirsten was saying, is that in September, IEA is organizing first ever Critical Minerals and Clean Energy Summit. And its basis for you, as I told already, World's Energy Authority in that action with G7, with G20, constructing the new, let's say, energy pact for the world, is something that I think we need to hear also here in Europe. So please.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And let me just say thanks to Kirsten and Guntram for your framing remarks. I think you've outlined the transformational challenge very well that lies ahead. But I thought it might be useful really just to say a few words about just how impressively, in our opinion, European Union in particular has responded to the huge challenges of the past year. And since we're a data-driven organization, I'm going to mention a few data points just to put this all in context a little bit, because it's important, I think, as we look at how the current energy security challenges are being tackled, and what sort of, as you touched on sort of a little bit briefly, energy security challenges lie ahead as we look to transforming our energy system and moving to a clean energy economy. So before the February 2014 Russian invasion, Europe, as I think you all know, was Russia's main client for oil and gas exports, imported about 55% of Russia's oil exports, and 75% of Russian gas exports went to Europe. Today, Russian pipeline flows to Europe have fallen 80% from pre-invasion levels, and Europe has halted the vast majority of Russian oil and Russian coal imports. And in this year, in 2023, the share of Russian pipe gas in EU gas demand is expected to drop below 10%, while LNG is expected to account for over 35% of supply. So this is just a piece of the diversification effort that was really important. Russian oil and gas revenues, importantly, have dropped almost 50%, and I think that's really quite significant, and I think an indication of the impact of the oil price cap, which was much discussed, but eventually put in place. So Russian monthly oil and gas revenues were about 20 billion per month pre-invasion. They have fallen to they fell to about 13 billion in March. They've edged up a little bit in April, so up to 15 billion. But there has been an impact, which I think is important. coming back to this, really some of the very important steps, Guntram mentioned them, that European member states have taken, filling gas storages to 90% fill level. They're now approximately 55% full, which is well above the 5-year average, which means that filling them again in this coming winter season will be a slightly less difficult lift to achieve the 90% fill rate. Of course, milder weather last year, slower economic activity, but also, really importantly, timely policy actions were really key to reducing gas demand through the 2022-23 winter season, which dropped by 5% year on year across key regions. And I think it's really important too to note that the challenges that Europe was facing last year with respect to the turmoil and gas markets in particular, in our view, and I think there's no question, again, looking at the data, have really accelerated the energy transition. The EU Power EU plan, EU's Fit for 55 package, other important regulations and incentives have really fast-tracked the transition in an important way and are really helping, again, to address the longer-term energy security challenges for Europe. Within 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU's seen 40% more solar and wind power additions, 40% more heat pump sales and installations, 15% more electric vehicle sales, investments in energy efficiency have jumped, and CO2 emissions across Europe have fallen by 2.5%. So clearly there's much more that needs to be done to accelerate investments in renewables and clean energy technologies, as was mentioned, of course, not only in Europe, but really across the world. And we've done a lot of work focusing in particular on what needs to be done to really accelerate the clean energy transition through both public and private sector investments in emerging and developing economies around the world to really move the needle there as well. One of the reports we came out with earlier this year, our Energy Technology Perspectives 2023, really pointed out the challenges with respect to the production, processing, and manufacturing of critical minerals, as was mentioned, as well as other key energy technologies, and really focused too on how heavily they are concentrated in just a few countries. So, in our view, addressing the challenges of the clean energy economy in Europe and elsewhere can really be aided by things such as this focus on critical raw materials, on the Green Deal Industrial Plan that is under consideration, and yes, to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act for all the discussion around it, in our view, is really helping to move the needle, not only in terms of the U.S. being able to meet its NDC, but really in our estimates, we see strong increases in new clean energy projects if all of these stated policies are implemented, with annual solar and wind capacity additions in the U.S. expanding 2.5 times over current levels by 2050, and EV sales expanding 7-fold. And I'm glad to hear that European companies have been a part of that as well. But let me also just close with a little bit of a cautionary note. We're not necessarily out of the woods in Europe or else globally either. We're anticipating, as we look ahead to this coming winter, that global glass supplies will likely remain tight this year, and global LNG supply growth, which Europe's obviously benefited from, won't be enough to offset the expected drop in Russia's pipe gas deliveries. Necessarily. So, and global gas demand elsewhere in the world is also growing in places like Asia and the Middle East. So just mentioning some of the uncertainties that we think are important to keep an eye on going forward: the prospect of the complete cessation of Russian pipe gas deliveries to the EU, the continued strong economic recovery in China, and the higher demand for LNG imports there, and of course, weather-related factors. So we've done a lot of work with Europe, I think, as is known. Over the past year, we will continue to do so. We think that yeah, as I said, that prospectively challenges undoubtedly still lie ahead. But we think the answer to all of this is really continuing to invest and accelerate in the investments in the new clean energy economy and make that the basis for stronger energy security in Europe and around the world going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. And I would just want to add, please, yeah, okay, that today European Union made first joint gas purchasing tender, so it closed the tender. Europe now has offers from 25 suppliers, and we'll see how this is going to be finished. We need 13.4 billion cubic meters of gas. That was the offer, and we got 11.6 million more than we wanted, so they say that is good. So we will see. We have first intervention from Janka.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I wanted to pick up on 2 points that were mentioned by Kirsten first and then by Guntram. So I think Kirsten is completely right in saying how we have to think differently about this and who needs to be brought on board. And I think we cannot stress enough while we're sitting here in like a bank, how important those guys are, the ones with the money. I think that is something we should stress very, very, very much. So if banks do not finance things anymore that are non-sustainable, if insurers don't insure it anymore, then we have a large portion of the job done. And I do think that European companies can provide the best case example of, can you do that and at the same time continue to remain profitable companies? If we can make that happen, then kind of the Europe that is irresistible that I was talking about in the beginning becomes a bit more of a reality. We can show that some of these things are possible. And this is what links me to the systemic competition bit that Guntram was mentioning. I couldn't agree more that I don't think that China is a partner for climate change. Actually, this was the main notion of my IWM fellowship last year, actually, here. But I believe it is for slightly different reasons than outlined. I don't think it is the biggest problem that we're facing, that China is going to continue to invest in coal technology at home. There's a moratorium in the Belt and Road Initiative now. It is more a problem that is doing both things at the same time. It is investing in renewable technologies like no other country. It is driving innovation in green technologies like no other country at the moment. If we look at sodium-ion batteries, if we look at all the EV developments more generally, what is happening in China is at a scale, and that's the beauty of the domestic market. You can scale up like no other, and we're losing out. European wind companies have to leave the business. We're not going to be part of this process anymore. So we are going to compete in this area against a competitor that is very aware of its own climate vulnerabilities, that is very aware of the kind of environment in which this is going to be the new trend with which you're going to make money. So the understanding is there in China that these are the economies that are going to be the economies of the future, the technologies of the future, the energy of the future, and the wealth and power of the future. And so I think we don't need to compete because they are stuck with an old model. I think we need to compete because they're really good at driving the green transformation forward while still investing in coal at the moment. And we need to not see the other, not like focus on the one thing while not seeing the other dimension.
Thank you so much. Ivan Krastev, then Taras.
I'll start with observation that probably Janka is not going to get a grant from the Chinese government soon. In my view, it's interesting to try to connect these three panels, because what interests me most is the politics of climate and the green transition. Because on the level of what should be done, I do believe that there's a certain type of economic agreement. You can have a differences exactly, transition time, but here's the problem, and this is why the idea of the polycrisis I find productive. The polycrisis is not simply that you have a different crisis, but first that the sum of them is more than basically the crisis put next to each other, but secondly, that you do not have the silver bullet. 1970s, and this is Adam Tooze, basically people believed that if you go beyond capitalism, simply if you manage to nationalize private property, all the problems are going to be solved. Listen, it could be illusionary, but it makes it easier to mobilize. And for example, in 1970s, very strong anti-nuclear war movement, they were trying to mobilize, pushing governments what not to do. Now you should push them what to do. which is very different. And I'm saying this because I'm afraid that at some point the things that we're talking about are going to get into a major confrontation. And this is when the time to decide is really to become complex. For example, the problem with the climate is very much also the relations between generations. You have young people for whom this is the most important issue. This is what politically defines them. But you know what? They don't have the numbers. It's a small cohort. They cannot electorally win on their own.
Influence, yeah.
So then they can become very alienated from democracy to the extent that St. Anthony's College has a polling show that the majority of young Europeans who are younger than 30 claimed that authoritarian regimes are going to do better when it comes to climate. So the story is, can you keep democracy and radical climate policy together? We cannot be sure. And we cannot be sure for several important reasons. You can see already in Germany with some of the green policies that basically people start to react. And we see this also during the COVID crisis. More and more people define freedom as don't interfere with my way of life. Mm-hmm. I'm going to allow you to redistribute big amount of money, but do not change my way of life. This is the only freedom that has remained to me. And by the way, this is coming from different sources. Like with the anti-vaxxer movement, it's come both from the left and from the right. And for me, the real problem for Europe, particularly because we're talking about different countries, very different societies, by the way, very different demography. Can you imagine how small the young generations are in Eastern Europe, where a lot of young people have left the countries, where the economic prosperity is very different? If we are not going to solve the politics of the green transition, you can have a backlash, which is going to be even worse than the status quo that we're talking about. And I do believe that this conversation is what I'm missing. Now you have elites in Europe which understood that this is an existential crisis. And if you see basically what the Commission is betting on, they're betting very much on the green transition. They're betting on this being reindustrialization and so on. But if we're not going to address the problem of politics of it, why the Dutch farmers are going to vote against? Why basically East European countries in the midst of the war are saying, stop talking to me about climate politics, let's focus on the war. How we can try to solve together multiple crises where there is not one silver bullet. In my view, this is the biggest story, and probably this is the problem with time to decide. This is time to decide on what.
And it comes to how can we then work on what Kirsten said, systemic change. How can we rebuild what we are missing now, and what you wrote a lot about? It's a trust, fabric of trust in our societies, and some kind of new social contract with whom, for what, when, and where. And in that, we have a huge label over our heads that connected with energy, what Russia represents, what China represents, and which we saw in Europe, and that is corruption. I'm sorry, Taras, I know that you tackled a lot issue of corruption. I don't know if that was your intervention, but I would really ask you to say something also about that.
The job title really, is following me everywhere. I want to thank you for that. I'm going to mention that, but first I want to go to what Kirsten talked about, which is that we might lose the grip on the very conditions of possibility for making adjustments and strategic choices and policies. And I think we've talked about Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine has been an impulse that has transformed the European energy landscape and policy responses to that. But also, of course, this war, at least for Ukrainians, has been the kind of calamity and the kind of catastrophe that might happen more often in form of emergencies, maybe climate emergencies, not wars, right? So it's something that we can also learn from, and learn from the responses that Ukrainians have put up in response to the invasion. And one thing that we see is that in a crisis and a calamity like that, the state is by far not the only actor that responds. The Ukraine needed to mobilize resources in response to the humanitarian catastrophe of the war and, of course, the military problems on a scale that it could not because of the lack of capacity for the state. But of course, if we are living in the age of climate emergency, and when these emergencies start to happen, states like Germany, France, and Italy will also not be able potentially to mobilize, certainly not Bangladesh or others, will not be able to mobilize the resources that they need at the scale and with the speed that they need to mobilize them. And here, of course, civil society steps in. In Ukraine, civic networks managed to mobilize quickly the sort of resources the military needed and also the humanitarian actors needed to bridge in time then for other forms of support to come through the state and humanitarian institutions. And these civic networks relied on mechanisms of coordination. There was a question about technology. They relied on mechanisms of communication coordination, right? However, these mechanisms, crucial as they were for people to mobilize, to start moving billions and billions of euros in the scale of weeks through civic networks, these mechanisms and these infrastructures, they were commercial, right? We heard about Starlink and the way in which that's crucial for military coordination at the front line and the way in which it is open to whims of one particular man. You can think about Facebook as a commercial infrastructure that's enabled coordination for civil institutions and the vulnerabilities that that brings, of course, right? And the market has basically become the kind of institution that has supported civic responses to crisis. So I think when we think about preparing long-term to be able to respond to many times one-off events that will start to happen in the context of climate emergency. Globally, we have to think about not just state policy, but also the kinds of social institutions and infrastructures that will be there in place to help. And on corruption, I want to say that Ukrainian response civic response has been enabled by flexibility and informality that all of the anti-corruption policies, all of the transparency policies have been trying to wipe out of Ukraine, to formalize civil society, to subject it to the tyranny of transparency, is what anthropologists have put it. So unfortunately, I'm going to speak here against the forms of anti-corruption that, in the way at least that we have practiced them as technocratic solutions to political problems, just to say that the kinds of challenges that we're going to be facing long-term with climate change all over the world will require exactly the kind of flexibility and potentially progressive democratic anti-bureaucratism that Ukrainians have embraced in their response to the invasion.
We go to Milica. Thank you so much for this. To Milica, and then I would like to go back to Guntram because he's going to leave us soon, so to hear some thoughts, please. Yes.
It might be that I work for international financial institutions, but I'll return to who's going to pay for this and how this is going to work. So I think you have an internal dimension and an external dimension. It's all about bringing coalitions so that this becomes a sustainable agenda. Internally within the EU is basically making sure that you don't destroy the single market, because if you're going to subsidize things, not everybody has the same economic strength to do it. And how you deal with the hard budget constraint on the other side, and with some countries openly saying that they're against more collective borrowing in future, where even has mentioned Adam Tooze, his solution is to have more of a debate on this issue, because what you had in COVID, you had a stronger public demand for Europe to move together. So you have an internal dimension to do all of this, to invest more, not to destroy the market, to make sure that the internal market survives, not to miss the hard budget constraint, and to make sure that it's just for everybody. You have external constraint. Europe's neighbors pollute more than Europe. And we've left the first session with the Polish tractor in between Ukraine's membership ambitions and actually membership. So it won't surprise you that the same constituency, not necessarily Polish, but the farmers, will actually be one of those groups with whom you'd need to make an accommodation, whether this is enlargement or this is green energy transition. So basically, where we left it last time, and how do you deal with neighbors, some of whom are going to be hit from 2026 by carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to make the whole thing more expensive for them. It's probably to create a coalition by transforming what this enlargement means. This is a transformative crisis. Neither Europe is going to be what it was, nor enlargement is going to be what it was, but it might be a way of sectorally including countries in a way which resolves the problem and aligning them fully with incentives and enforcements around the green agenda. And by this also making sure that they are more aligned in geopolitical and other terms. So I think it's probably what I'm returning to in every intervention. It is very difficult to have one-dimensional debate because they are really deeply interrelated. And if you don't want to have lithium from China, you might end up having it from another not so democratic places, which might still be geopolitically of the right orientation.
Anthony Barnett, then we will have Guntram.
I have a question really as both as a consumer of energy and as on a very small scale with 22 solar panels as a producer of energy. The solar panels, okay, were made in China. They've been there for 10 years, and that. And the question is this, because I'm very struck by what Kirsten was saying. The status quo is our greatest, threat, and very deep and profound changes are going to be needed, and therefore people are going to have to trust the system to deliver these changes. And what I feel is over this energy crisis, that is all very well to say, and it's good to say that the market pushed the price of energy up. That's good. We cut our energy consumption down. We were cold at times. That's good. And then you read that the banks have made 5 billion, billions and billions of profit because of the way the energy market is fixed. And not just the banks, the oil companies, the energy producers are making staggering profits. And at that point, you start to think, hold on a second, what is going on here? I don't mind paying more for my energy because I think energy should be expensive and I should consume less. But if the consequences of that are oligarchs going to buy even bigger yachts, then I think, hold on a second, I'm not going to trust the transitional system or the demands that are going to be made on me. So I feel that this question of the super profits that are being made out of this crisis and how to deal with that, and it's not just a matter of adding taxes, but of actually seeing that there is a systemic need to build trust, and the way the market, which may be very well in terms of cutting consumption, but the way it is generating a completely unjustifiable profits is undermining the actual future, the capacity to make the changes that Kirsten said we need to do.
Well, just a few reactions and comments to what has been said. I mean, I think on the last point, the energy rents of last year, 22 was a disastrous year for the West and a golden year for Russia. Why was it golden? Because Russia continued to export actually more oil and gas during 22 than it did in the previous years, and on top of it at higher prices. Right, so Russia made huge profits last year, and the prices were so high because of the uncertainty about how we would deal with Russia and what would happen to Russia as the most important energy supplier in the world, and this in the world of gas, and the second most important in the world of oil. So this was failed sanctions policy, and I've been writing on this with Ricardo Hausmann, for example, at Harvard. We've been writing very strongly about the need to establish a tariff system and essentially tax away the profits. Now that wasn't chosen in the end. The choice that was taken was a choice about a price cap, but as you know, the price cap was only implemented as of January/February this year. The price cap does have effects now, and you see that Russia's revenues in the first quarter of this year have actually fallen very substantially. The state revenues have fallen, the revenues of the oil companies have fallen, but of course it's still not perfect. Russia is still making money, significant money on its oil. It sells the oil to India and to China, which is in part what the price cap wanted. I mean, the price cap didn't say Russia shouldn't supply the world market, but should do it below a certain price. And I've just published actually a piece in which we argue with a few colleagues from the Kiev School of Economics that we need to start using financial sanctions to tighten the effectiveness of the price cap and make sure that the profits of Russia really get minimized. So this is, I would say, the story of last year. It's a story of failed sanction policy in the energy field against Russia. And it was a mistake on so many grounds. But here we are, and finally we have something in place that works and actually reduces the extraordinary profits of Russia. Now, the second point I want to make is on China again. So look, global emissions, despite all the COPs that we have, are growing. They are growing massively. Global cooperation on climate change does not work at the moment. Just give you the number, the last 10 years, global emissions have grown from 34, CO2 emissions, yeah, so this is just a part of the emissions, 34.5 gigatons to 37 gigatons. So it's a 2.5 gigaton increase. That drives climate change. Now, who's the main factor driving this increase? I mean, it's not the European Union. The European Union has gone down by 0.5 gigatons in those 10 years, is now below 3 gigatons. It's China. I mean, China has grown its emissions, annual emissions, from 9.5 to 11.5 gigatons. So this is one of the main drivers of global climate change by now. We have to confront this reality and find a way of getting China to accelerate its own climate ambitions. It's not going to be enough if China starts doing this after 2030 or 2040. It's not going to be enough. It pushes us much, much more quickly to the tipping points that Kirsten has, I think, really mentioned very clearly, and that are a big headache. So we need to accelerate climate action in China. We need to think about levers to convince China to do this more quickly, both within China, but also in Belt and Road Initiative countries. There's some movement, and I agree with that, but it's just not enough. Third point on the technology, and Janka, I mean, I'm actually somewhat less worried about this technology competition. I mean, in a sense, yes, there is this technology competition. But competition drives the speed, all right? And we want this technology to develop and to be quicker. And the response to the Chinese competition was the IRA, the US IRA, and that tremendously accelerates the development of new technologies that will actually help us tackle this global problem. So in that sense, I'm not worried. I'm worried that we might lose out and not invest enough. And that's why I think it's part of the systemic rivalry. But as such, I welcome that China and the US, of course, invest in this. Very last point, very quick, just on the solar panels from China. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how worrying it is that we import all these solar panels from China. Well, how worrying is it really? I mean, it's not like gas, right? I mean, gas, you switch off the tap. Solar panels, okay, if the Chinese stop selling us solar panels, the solar panels still operate, the energy is still there. So yes, there are some risks, but the nature of those risks is a very different one to the nature of the risk of the direct dependency that we've had on Russia with the gas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mary and then Kim. Just a second, Mary needs to talk. Sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on a little bit on the issue of the politics of the green transition, which Ivan had highlighted. And I think that there's no question we need to be thinking harder about how we build stakeholders in a very inclusive way for the transition. Of course, it requires leadership, no question there, and I think that's a really important starting point. But there's a reason why there's so much discussion about just transitions and people-centered transitions, because our leaders need to be able to demonstrate what the benefits are going to be, right? There are going to be winners and losers as this transition moves forward. But our analysis, and we just issued at the IEA the first global energy employment outlook last year, and we'll be updating it again this year, shows that significant numbers of jobs are going to be created in the new energy economy, though of course it's going to require investment and job retraining and all of that. The new plants are not, industries are not going to be where the current ones are, so it's a very complicated set of issues, no doubt. But I think the focus on this area is very well placed and really important. And it's another reason why there's been significant attention to what's called these just energy transition partnerships in a number of countries around the world to help them with the transition away from the thermal coal-fired plants. And I think Indonesia is a very positive case in point where that's now moving forward. Second point I'd like to make, again, in this subject of inclusivity or everyone playing their part, really important that all of the sectors of our economies and the energy system look at doing so, playing their part. And a number of comments have been made about the significant resources that the oil and gas industry has had, windfall profits over the last year or so. We just issued a few days ago a piece exactly on this topic of what the oil and gas industry can and should do in terms of really working to reduce its emissions, and have assessed that it has the technology, it's got the money, it's got the know-how to reduce emissions by 60% by 2030. So that's a challenge there for that particular industry. And then third, coming back to some of the points we talked about a little bit earlier today, again on this subject of inclusivity, I think it's really important that we think hard about how all of our institutions, including global organizations such as ours, begin to open the doors, which we've been doing since 2015, to non-members in different ways. So we now have 11 association countries that are part of the IEA. They're not full members, but they're important in terms of the global energy economy. That includes China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, a number of other countries, and the most recent one that became part of this broader family is Ukraine. So just wanted to make that point of our strong attention to the energy challenges that Ukraine is facing today and will be facing going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kim, Ivan shortly, and then as Guntram and Mary needs to leave at 7:15 sharp because they're catching a plane, we'll open the floor to you, please.
Great, just a couple of quick points. One is that I appreciate why we're talking about this as an emergency. We're often also talking about emergency government. And one of the things I would like to know is exactly what that means. Are we talking about executives overriding reluctant parliaments by decree? Are we talking about EU having broader scope to act without over national objections? Are we talking, I get nervous about emergency government because then you may not have the political conditions you need to move forward. So as we think about climate emergencies, I understand that terminology. I wish we could get more specific about what is ruled out. Does it mean overriding rights, for example? Two, we're talking about this, of course, without history, and of course, one of the reasons why it's been difficult to get China to the table or India to the table, right, is their objection is, you guys benefited from the Industrial Revolution and dumping all this carbon in the air, and just when it got to this tipping point, you're telling us we can't do it, right? So I'm just wondering what people on the panel think about what we deal with that historical argument, which strikes me as being really something that is not a trivial argument. And then the third,
Africa in that debate. It will need another time to decide summit, hopefully.
Exactly, which just brings me to a very quick third point, which is, who are the people who suffer the most from the climate change events we already see? And this goes to the social solidarity point, right? It's poor people. Poor people in the world, poor people in all of our countries. Where are the areas that flood? Where are the areas that are vulnerable to forest fires? Where, all of these kinds of things. And there's a social solidarity problem within countries, as we try to address some of these issues. And I'm afraid that one of the reasons why the issues are not being addressed as quickly as they should is that the people who benefit immediately in the short term are exactly the people who are not supporting the governments who would be doing this because they've dropped out of politics altogether.
Thank you so much. Even shortly, and then the questions,
I just
please.
say how unlucky East Europeans are with the words. Can you imagine transition? Again, for the people, this is like naming your son Mao just the day before Albania is going to break with China. It's very difficult to make people to trust something that is called transition, and I do believe that unfortunately here we are not on the lucky side.
Thank you so much. Questions, please. Lights on and hands up. I don't see in the dark. Can you just, yeah, thank you. Second row, gentleman with a scarf, first one.
Hi, this is Thomas Eppinger from a magazine in Austria, Pragmaticus. Just one simple question. So there are billions of people poorer than Europeans. And I think what they strive for is getting wealth, getting iPhones, getting houses, getting cars, traveling. And they will judge the European way of fighting climate change from a simple point of view. Does it make the Europeans more healthy, or does it make it poorer? And there's nothing done good for climate if we are going net zero and nobody will follow us. So do you think that any country in the world will follow the European model if the European model turns out making people poorer?
Who wants to answer? Mary? You want to pick up on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to make the point that there is no one-size-fits-all for the energy transition. Sorry, I don't have a better word for it right now. And that different countries around the world, especially in the global south and emerging and developing economies, will have a different starting point. There are still over 700 million people without access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa, and a large number, also many, many millions without access to clean cooking. So, you know, the starting point and the path will be different for many countries. So I would just be a little bit cautious about this notion of following a particular model. That does not go over terribly well for countries that are still much further behind in terms of their economic development, their industrialization, and their efforts to tackle basic electricity access issues. That does not mean that we shouldn't, and certainly we are as an organization and our member countries very much focused on and supportive of looking for ways to provide policy advice and support, and also looking for ways to really unlock the capital that's going to be important to invest in the renewables and clean energy sector in those economies.
And I don't, if I can intervene as a moderator, where is Misha? We have Paris Climate Accord. We have, various multilateral agreements of international community that is not just European issue. And in October, if I remember it right, 2021, Vladimir Putin issued 2060 Russia climate neutral policy. So there are, it's not European problem. It's what Kirsten said. It's a global problem, but it depends, what are the odds to come there, basically. So second hand, please.
Thank you. My name is Teresa Filippi. I'm a lawyer here in Vienna. And I just wanted to comment or to add one remark on the question where democracy erodes. And in my perception, democracy erodes in the comfort zone. So as a comment to all the hassles of changing, of transformation, and the speeding up of transformation due to the pandemic and due to the war against Ukraine. And I apologize for just raising this question now, because it sort of comes back to geopolitical issues, and this is the topic of the forgotten country of Afghanistan. I was an activist 20 years ago trying to support women's rights there after the fall of the Taliban, and I was really I was just terrified about the withdrawal of the US troops from there. And my question is whether this was an encouragement for Putin to start his attack, because it was just half a year later. and maybe part of his miscalculation of the reactions he would get or he would create. And last question about the focus on China as a systemic rival. What should happen in order to focus on other countries like India as systemic partners, rather than just putting China into the main focus? And then a final remark on solar panels. I'm in touch with some young activists in the Lebanon, and they tell me that people there get their own solar panels in a sort of individual procurement in order to get independent from their corrupt government that deprives them of a public supply of energy. So this is just to add it to the full picture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These questions were not at all from the comfort zone, so I appreciate it so much more because they're from the ground, from your work, and these are really questions of our polycrisis that were mentioned here. Gunther, please answer.
No, I wanted to focus on the India point, but also refer and put it in the context of the historical emissions. I really do think, as I also mentioned in my speech, that those countries that have emitted historically a lot, which is, of course, the industrial countries. China's catching up very fast, though, but of course, we are still ahead in terms of historical emissions. We have an obligation, of course, to support countries in managing their energy transition. And poor people want to develop, and for that they need energy. And the question is really, will they get green energy or will they get alternatives? And that is a question of the price at the end of the day, because when you're poor, you don't have a choice, right? I mean, you can't sort of opt for the more expensive solution because, you just wouldn't have the resources for it. So I think the whole question of what kind of energy partnerships, climate partnerships, technology partnerships, financial partnerships is totally at the center of tackling the climate problem. And India is a very good example because India is now at a stage where it really develops very rapidly. And if it continues with that kind of growth and on a fossil fuel base, it's going to be a catastrophe for global climate. Can we change it? I think so, yes. I think we can make offers to China, to India, which are interesting and which involve bringing down the financing costs, which involve technological partnerships and others. So I would really support that avenue as the key avenue to tackle climate change now.
I leave Afghanistan to Kirsten's final wrap-up of everything, if I may. Third hand in the air, please. Please, second row.
If there's no more hand up, I'll speak. I wanted to say this to Taras in private, but I can say it also in public. I'm extremely grateful for you mentioning and bringing the topic of civil society as a fabric of society that enables society to be resilient, to hold against crisis. And I think in all three panels, this should have been mentioned. It's sad that it only comes in the last one, but I think this is really a very important aspect, and an aspect where we as the Foundation, I am working for the Erste Foundation, can really also do something. And this is the time to decide, and I think it's the time to decide for us to really put resources and effort in there, because in the democracy field, also in the long-term resilience of systems against each other, I think civil society plays a crucial part. So thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if there is. I think the subject and the interventions of, okay, first time? Okay, please. You have an award for the best question in every panel.
Only if nobody else raises a question, thank you. No, I wanted to bring the issue of how we actually orchestrate the process of energy transitions. How we can ensure that they are inclusive, how we can ensure that they are participatory. You know, we are talking a lot now about creating new jobs, creating welfare and income through these new jobs. We talk about reskilling people, etc. And all of that is exceedingly important. But I think we also need to remind ourselves that currently, for example, women are severely underrepresented in the energy sector. So if we don't take particular care in bringing women into that process of the energy transition, we will create a new situation that perpetuates the inequalities that are currently existing and actually makes them worse. And on the international level, it was pointed out the map of the ETH that shows how the global influence changes depending on whether we have fossil fuels or renewable energy as a major source of our energy. That will require mechanisms and processes at the international level and at the global level to help make the transition in a peaceful way. Because the countries that lose influence, the countries that lose clout, are not going to give that up easily. So there's nothing, we have nothing at the international level at this point. So I think this warrants a lot of reflection also. Thank you.
So thank you so much for all of your interventions. We don't have time, unfortunately. I would just point out, so inequality, geopolitics, democracy, everything led us to what Kirsten was advocating or calling for, this systemic change that needs to be done for us. So please wrap up this session and what you pick up from this, what we heard.
I will attempt to do that. Not a small ask. I think there are a couple of threads I'd like to bring out. One has to do with the ultimate need we have, which is to change demand. Because I think one of the things that we keep having conversations around is supply. And we are not at the moment in a demand-side crisis, we're in a supply-side crisis. We need to shift demand. Really what that amounts to is every society in a developed context finding ways to live with less energy, to meet human needs well, with less energy, less resources, and less materials. Then I want to come to this question of making Europeans poorer. One of the most interesting and helpful things I have read in the last 6 months is a woman who put out a blog saying, actually, if we really think about it, we are currently living in a scarcity world, in a scarcity mindset. And almost everything that we know about the alternative ways that in which we need to live, the technologies, the business models, the industrial models, are in fact significantly more abundant than we have understood. Precisely to the point that if you have a solar panel and or 26 solar panels and you're generating energy, you become a generator of wealth for yourself, for your community, for your neighborhood, for this local sports field if you generate excess. So there are real shifts in opportunities. There is an immense, and I really want to echo this question around green skills and green jobs. Europe has some of the best jobs in the world in terms of their balance and their protection. Europe actually is producing 30% of the new green technologies globally. That's a huge number. Now, there's a huge issue in terms of how that is operationalized into jobs. But just another number, there are 35 million roofs in Paris that need retrofitting, and there are 60,000 roofers. And that replicates over and over and over again. There is an enormous wealth of new jobs, new prosperity to be made. But it's a systems shift leading to paradigm shift on how to live, how to imagine industrial models, industrial systems, business models, relationships with resources and the environment above all. And I think that leads me then to just picking up on several points that has been named here that ultimately comes down for Europe to policy coherence. We are talking about the excess profits that Russia made. Well, Exxon posted 56 billion last year. That's 450 times more than the amount of money that the world has managed to collect together to fund loss and damage. 1 year of profits. So one of the things we need to ask ourselves is not just what Russia is profiting from, but we are subsidizing oil and gas. Where there are subsidies, there is an incoherence. Where there are market incentives to continue to allow the price of fossil to be low, there is an incoherence in policy. And I think there is something here about really looking very carefully at the whole system of consequences and of cause and effect to ask ourselves, to come back to our question of principled-based peacemaking, principle-based transition, principle-based call for action, and principle-based governance and peacemaking. So then I think that for me, just if we bring it back to this notion of civil society, and particularly the idea of, and I want to link your challenge, Kim, around why the language of emergency. My experience in a European context is that European infrastructure and governance processes was set up for stabilizing in chaotic environments. It's not particularly well effective and designed for agile, rapid mobilization of funds to people on the ground in civil society context. And actually, that's what emergency measures in many ways have enabled. Or companies to collaborate together where otherwise competition law makes it very difficult. There are elements here about using perhaps emergency contexts to begin to help us experiment with alternative forms of deployment, of governance, and of standards and principles for acting that need to become a new normal, that do enable agility and that do enable empowerment, another word that we've used in the course of today. And I lastly would want to finish with, we know that the 6th most effective intervention on climate is the education of women and girls. We have a project currently in Den Haag being run on global governance for climate emergency, which is effectively trying to understand what is the backup solution to a global governance system if nation states cannot get it together and if their global process of the UNFCCC is not achieving change in time. And so, again, how do we begin to think about these not centralized, unified, sequential, organized mechanisms, but perhaps polycentric, multiple, distributed, decentralized, that need to be connected into a network of networks. And that's a new organizational governance, political, economic form, and something that we can begin to learn and experiment with as we deal with transformation and crisis.
Thank you so much. Mary Warlick and Guntram Wolf needs to run, so run. Thank you so much for your inputs. Anthony Barnett, thank you. Milica Delević, thank you. Kirsten Dunlop, thank you. Taras Fedirko, thank you so much. Gerald Knaus, thank you. Ivan Krastev, thank you. Jan Werner Miller, thank you. Janka Oertel, thank you. Soli Oertel, thank you. Katrina Pelczynska-Nalic, thank you. Lane Scheppele, thank you. Mary and Guntram already said. I want to thank Ivan Vejvoda and Boris, Marte, Erste Foundation and Institute of Social Sciences Vienna for hosting us and for bringing us this very important thing which is called Europe Futures Fellows Program. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank my dear colleague Misha Glenny and you all for listening to us all the afternoon. Thank you to all the people who worked on this. Boris and Ivan, please join us on the stage.
Hello. You hear me? Just give us a moment until we go. You're all invited to have dinner with us together. So I have some remarkable figures from our social media team. About more than 150 posts reached almost 20,000 people this afternoon, which is a fantastic figure. And we had 400 people following the stream on YouTube and other sites. So check out Erste Foundation's Instagram account and Twitter feed and help us to spread the topics discussed here beyond the room. So thank you very much for all of this, for your attention. Thank you to the teams. Now, yes, we have some special surprise. Where are they? Yes. Because there's one woman we would love to thank because she was basically the curator leadership here. So that you all are here is thanks to Desi. And Desi, we want to thank you really, really, really for let's see. Then a big clap to our moderators, Ivana and Misha. You did a fantastic job. Thank you very much.
Bravo.
Flowers.
Oh dear.
Flowers, flowers.
How embarrassing.
I want to give flowers to someone.
And Misha.
This is for the questions
Yeah.
today.
Let me. Let me quickly say something, because it is. I don't know how you feel now, but I'm full of thoughts and lists of things we have to do. And which have to be done. I remember transforming crisis, and it always reminds me, transforming crisis, right? It always, or polycrisis, transform even in polycrisis, new design for human life. It always reminds me of a picture of a Viennese philosopher from the Wiener Kreis, Otto Neurath, who once said, like, changing the science system is like Schiffsumbau auf hoher See. So rebuilding your ship on high sea. And this needs a lot of different knowledge and skills than building a ship on land. But rebuilding a ship on high sea is a completely different philosophy of how to transform. Now, this will be the topic of tomorrow here, because tomorrow we as Astor Foundation will have our first community encounter meeting with all the partnerships we have in place. And basically what we're talking about tomorrow is exactly that. How can we get transformation done? And we talking about transformation psychology, about behavior, about food, right? What is the future of food, and about rare earths. So if anybody has time tomorrow be here, it's going to be fantastic. It will be a completely different setup. You cannot imagine how this room will transform this night. Huh? So just having said this, Ivan.
Yeah. I want to thank again the speakers for diligently sitting throughout this afternoon and evening. So once again, thank you. You have all been named, but again, thanks to Ivana and Misha, who's really done a terrific job in keeping this conversation alive and kicking until the very end. And I will simply end by saying something that we all know but needs to be repeated. The struggle for freedom and democracy is something we do every day when we get up, if we understand that it is never given on a silver platter. So it goes for the understanding that climate is a huge challenge, that there are geopolitical challenges, that we are being buffeted, that democracy and freedom are being strangled in a great part of the world, and that we are this continent where everybody does want to come with all the inefficiencies and dysfunctionalities. And I think that's why having a discussion like this, Boris and I still have our sleeves rolled up, so we will continue to do that, and I hope that we all come back in some shape or form next year for Time to Decide #3. And thank you all for being here with us throughout the day and for your questions. And now we will enjoy the buffet that is outside or somewhere in this huge and lovely green building. But Boris, maybe you can say more.
Join us, meet us, and talk. Start building relationships. We need new alliances here. Now, just finalizing, this wouldn't have been possible without a fantastic team. So let me mention Claudia and Emily. They were responsible for the setup. Claudia, fantastic. My team, the team of the foundation, Marianne, Barbara, Elena, Sarah, Maribel, Benjamin, Gerhard Radinger, Sabine, Laura, Mira, Hedwig, Lubica, Dino, Thomas Geuser, Thomas Kläuber, the great social media team we have, Rolf and Olena, the IWM team, Appa, who is doing the live stream, Esel, the film crew, Ibar, all of them! Thank you. So come be our guest. Next year, we'll have the 3rd edition of Time to Decide, and honestly, I can't wait for it. Thank you.
Thank you.